Welcome to Healthcare du Jour, where we dish up and digest the latest in healthcare. For the next 30 minutes, sit back as we bring you insight, commentary, and discussion on trending topics to the table, all expertly served up by our host and his guests. Healthcare du Jour is sponsored by Essay Ignite, the law offices of Miracle Connell, and the Compliancy Group. And now here's your host, Matt Fisher.
Back, and thank you for joining us as we dive into the hottest topics in healthcare. I'm your host, Matt Fisher. Today we're joined by Dr. Denise Basow, the President and CEO of Clinical Effectiveness at Wolters Kluwer. Welcome to the broadcast, Denise.
Thank you.
So it's great to have you on today. Maybe to start off, you could give everyone a little bit of your background.
So I'm a primary care physician by training, and I practiced medicine for about 4 years. And then I became aware of this, what was then a startup business called UpToDate, which I thought was a really good idea, trying to help clinicians practice medicine by bringing the best information that to bear on the care of patients. And although it was a startup at the time, I thought it was a really interesting idea and decided to join as an editor there. And that was 20 years ago. And I've had various positions at the company since then. But most recently, I've been the CEO of the business and then expanded that to include the clinical drug information at Wolters Kluwer over the last year.
That's great. My wife is a physician as well, so I actually am familiar with UpToDate. I think it was during med school they could do projects where they would submit material for it. So it's, I've heard of it for a long time and know it is a great resource. So thank you. But why don't we dive into our topics, which I think we're going to be focusing on clinical effectiveness today. So I guess as a start, would you be able to provide everyone a little bit of a background and kind of what it means to you? Because I have a feeling this is one of those terms that, like a lot of the hot terms in healthcare, has a different meaning to everybody at the moment.
Yeah, there's the official definition, I guess, of clinical effectiveness that was put out by the Department of Health and Human Services. Talks about applying the best knowledge that we can derive from research, from clinical experience, and from patient preferences to achieve optimal process and outcomes of care for patients. So that's a mouthful and doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. The way we like to articulate this internally is very aligned with what the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, the IHI, has discussed in terms of the triple aim, which is to improve the quality of care, reduce the cost of care, and enhance the patient experience.
So yeah, no, that definitely sounds like it's in line with all the goals of healthcare reform. So in terms of it's interesting that you said that HHS has a definition. So when did HHS come out with that definition? Do you know, is it kind of tied with the timing of the Affordable Care Act, or is it something that maybe predates that and shows that everyone was thinking about this prior to the ACA?
Clinical effectiveness isn't really a new concept. We've talked about this for many years. I'm not exactly sure when the definition arose, but for a long time we've talked about the difference between the efficacy of a particular intervention, either a therapeutic intervention or a diagnostic test, the efficacy of that, which is what happens within the well-controlled world of clinical trials, so where we control everything about the circumstances in the patient, versus the effectiveness of one of those interventions, which is what happens in the real world when things aren't so perfect. So this clinical efficacy, what we know works in perfect conditions, versus clinical effectiveness, what we know happens in the real world, that's a concept that's been around for quite a while.
Right. Yeah, no, it's I think an important distinction to be able to make as well, because it's so often you hear about all these promising things that may be coming out of a clinical trial, but then once you actually, as you said, get into the real world and practice, and the reality is sometimes different than, as you were saying, what can happen in the under perfect conditions.
Right. Yeah. So a good example of that would be something like, you take something like screening for colorectal cancer, where we know in clinical trials that that colonoscopy has high efficacy, or colonoscopy is very good for detecting, for the early detection of colorectal cancer for screening. But when you get out into the real world, there's a lot more that has to go right for this to happen. So first, the clinicians or the primary care physicians have to understand which patients should be screened for colorectal cancer and instruct them to get that test. Then you have to share that information with patients in a way that helps them understand or become advocates for their own care, so that they'll actually do the test when they're otherwise feeling well. And why would you want to go through something like a colonoscopy when you otherwise feel well? So there's education involved in that. And then you have to have a group of gastroenterologists. You have to have enough to service the needs of that primary care population, so that patients can actually schedule tests in a reasonable time frame and relatively easily. And then they have to have the preparation for the test and actually have to show up for it on the day that their appointment is, which isn't a trivial matter. So every place in that chain can break and decrease the effectiveness of what we otherwise know is a very good screening test.
Right, and I think that's kind of all those elements that you just pointed out. As you said, it is very easy to have a break occur at any place along that chain.
Right.
So just kind of thinking about a lot of the new developments in terms of wanting to focus on patient-centeredness of care, and really more of a collaborative nature. Have you seen kind of any effective strategies, or do you have any thoughts in terms of how to maybe emphasize that patient aspect to it? So maybe on my biased opinion, it seems like that might be an area where you're more likely to have a breakdown than within the provider side of it.
Yeah, I think we see breakdowns, unfortunately, all across the chain. So I think there's certainly a knowledge piece of this on the side of the clinicians, that they have to understand to do the right things. And then there's how we share that information for patients. And I think that there's really been an explosion of information out there for patients, but making sure that we get the right information into the hands of patients. And it's not just purely information. It's also, I think we hear the term patient engagement now is a very popular term, which again is one of those that people define in all sorts of ways. But the way that I think about patient engagement now is that we're really moving from a time where physicians are the center of the universe to a time when patients really need to become the center of the healthcare universe. And so when I think of patient engagement, I think about whatever tools we can bring to help patients really become advocates of their own care and become informed enough that they can that they can be self-advocates.
Right. So, and I guess that's a good way to say, kind of what tools are available to help with this. And I guess I'd break that into maybe what tools are currently available, and then also what tools are you aware of that might be developed or would you hope could be developed?
Yeah, so I think that there are certainly tools available for when we talk about that whole link of effective care. I think there are tools that come to play at various parts of that chain. So you have everything from the system side of things, or the system perspective on things, where if we go back to our colonoscopy example, simple things like, as I mentioned, efficient scheduling systems, or simple reminders for patients. Those robocalls that you start getting that I think I was talking to somebody the other day, and they said they had an appointment for something and had 3 phone calls and 2 text messages, and that may be, we may be going a little bit overboard on those things now, but we'll, as with everything, that'll come back to equilibrium at some point. But all of these things are part of that system of providing effective care. And then you also have the knowledge side of things, because that's really at the center of it, or where it all begins.
Right.
And this is knowledge that's required both for the clinicians and knowledge that's required for patients. And we shouldn't underestimate that, because I think sometimes for non-physicians, you assume that your physicians know everything, and the dirty little secret is actually they don't.
Yeah, I'd like to say that's why they call it the practice of medicine, because you're continually learning and trying to evolve how you're providing care.
Exactly, and there may have been a time when I think it was easier to know, maybe not everything, but close to everything. But we all know that the knowledge explosion has just really been amazing over the last decade or so. And so the volume of knowledge that healthcare providers asked to consume is nearly impossible. And even if providers could keep up with the information that's in their specialty, how you apply that to the patient that's sitting in front of you, and therefore how you can explain things to that patient is really difficult. And really what I mean by that is, in medical school, we're all taught how to interpret a study. So we can obviously read a study, we know what the results say, we can look at the methodology and understand if it was a high quality study or our lower quality study. So that we can all do. But then that piece of information, that data, and put that in the context of everything else that's been published about that particular problem, that is a very difficult task. And now you take that and say, by the way, you have to do that while the patient is sitting in front of you waiting for an answer to something, and it's just impossible to do without tools to help that.
Right.
So that's where tools like UpToDate, things that have come up to try to synthesize that medical knowledge and provide evidence-based guidance to clinicians, really become important. And now we can also extend that knowledge and share that with patients as well. And then I think the next iteration of that is, again, what I was terming patient engagement, to not just provide that as information that patients read, but really to help them become more actively involved in the decision-making process.
Right, because that was actually a couple of your statements that were going to lead to a follow-up question for me, which was, you're using the UpToDate as one example of, recognizing that that's probably primarily a resource geared towards the providers. And I think you also said now you're starting to see resources geared towards the patients. Is there a disconnect in terms of what information is being presented? Because I'd have a feeling that I probably wouldn't understand the information as how I might want to receive it if I was actually a physician or a provider. So I feel like I'd want to receive that in one type of context, but have it framed differently as the patient. So I'm wondering if is that an accurate portrayal of how those kind of resources go, and does that kind of exacerbate or not encourage the collaborative space we're trying to get to?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it depends on the context, or I think it depends on the patient, obviously, and it depends on the problem that the patient has. So I think if you're a well-educated guy, and if you or one of your family members were to get a serious illness, you would learn the language of that disease very well in a way that you wouldn't learn the language of other aspects of medicine. And you probably want to know exactly what your doctors know. You probably want to read the same thing that your doctor is reading. And we see that all the time for patients with serious illnesses. On the other hand, if you're not fortunate to have to be as educated, or if the problem you have maybe isn't quite so serious, I think packaging that in a different way is very appropriate. And the important point is that that you as a patient can kind of choose where you want to go with that, and that we should be providing the tools that allow you to do that at whatever level you're capable of understanding at whatever level that you choose to engage.
Right. Yeah, and I think kind of as you said, that finding that happy balance is really part of the movement towards getting both the provider and the patient working together. So it shouldn't be, the relationship shouldn't necessarily be centered solely on one side or the other, but it should be, I guess, at least in my opinion, somewhere in the middle. So, everyone's coming together to figure out how best to render the care.
Yeah, I think sometimes sometimes the feeling is that physicians don't want their patients coming in with too much information or asking for things that they don't want them to ask for. And the truth is that virtually all physicians that I'm around actually we want very much for patients to be educated and to have the best information that they can have, because I think we're recognizing more and more how important that is in achieving effective care. But I think the issue is that or where it becomes problematic is if patients come in with the wrong information or incorrect information, and that can lead to that can be frustrating. So I think what we're trying to do is provide tools whereas we like to say here, we can all read off the same playbook, so that we're all talking about the same thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, because it's, when I'm working with some clients, it's certainly a frustration that is conveyed over to me is, getting all this information, but, is it actually helpful? Because then you're getting people asking for things that might not actually apply to what the real underlying medical issue is that comes out as you work face-to-face with somebody, as opposed to necessarily kind of doing all your own research.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So, and kind of all that engagement, to me, also seems to not play a role with, but align with kind of the move towards alternative payment methodologies that certainly has been a pretty big focus in the industry over the past few years, because that certainly puts a lot of pressure or emphasis on quality measures. So, and I guess it seems like there would be a connection between that and clinical effectiveness. So would you be able to talk to that a little bit?
Sure. So alternative payment models are all about incenting healthcare networks, healthcare providers to provide high quality care at the lowest cost possible. So that's very much aligned with the pillars of clinical effectiveness that I spoke about earlier. And an important piece of that is as physicians, as healthcare networks are preparing for these alternative payment models, one of the things that you see happening is that care is more and more getting moved away again from physicians being at the center of that universe, and really occurring more across the healthcare spectrum. So for nurses, for pharmacists, for rehab specialists, everywhere across the continuum, you're seeing much more care practiced across that spectrum. And that, of course, now requires that we coordinate all of this. And yes, that coordination requires those systems, some of the things that I spoke about earlier, the system side of things. And it also, again, speaks to that reading off the same playbook concept that we talked about earlier for patients as well, because you want everybody along that continuum to have the same types of tools, whether that's an electronic health record that they're using and that they're sharing information about the patient, whether that's the clinical knowledge that they're using, or whether it's how they, drugs that they should be prescribing. All of those things you want, you not only want, but you need all of that to be consistent now across that entire spectrum to really improve the efficiency and effectiveness of care.
Yeah, no, kind of the breadth that you're just talking about is certainly something that presents a lot of challenges, and I'm going to pick up on a point to start with from what you were just describing, which was and this is probably rephrasing a little bit, but the challenges of the electronic health records or the electronic medical records. So I guess it feels like, especially because we keep hearing in the news that they don't work well together. It's hard to get information out of it or get the information you want into it. So kind of, is that the heart of it, or are there other issues with the EHR that are either a barrier to or hampering kind of the further development of clinical effectiveness at the moment?
Yeah, I don't know if they're necessarily hampering it, but I'm not sure that they've achieved some of the goals that were set out to achieve by implementing EHR systems. So, I mean, we really are at this very interesting time now in healthcare technology, where certainly in the U.S., but even more and more globally, where the EHR has really won the day and become the established workflow for physicians. But if we look at what EHRs were meant to do, they probably have not satisfied our clinical effectiveness challenge. And there are actually lots of data now that show that if you that show that implementation of EHR systems alone don't actually improve care. That really, to improve care, you need to implement some kind of decision support along with that. And I was reading an article the other day, and I won't get the quote exactly right. I'll paraphrase a bit, but I really like this, where they talked. The person quoted said, we didn't spend tens of billions of dollars to just get off of paper. But in effect, that's what's happened. So now we need to take that, though, and the EHR has performed an important function, and now we need to take that and we need to build on that and do better. And I do think that it provides a way for us to now have a bigger impact and begin to implement tools that will help us achieve clinical effectiveness.
Right. It seems like, kind of picking up on some of the other themes you talked about, we need to get the EHR to itself be part of a continuum. It shouldn't just be one endpoint or one point on the road. It should be part of a larger picture where it's interacting. Because kind of what you were saying about how to succeed with the alternative payment methodologies, and also just to provide overall broader-based better care, we're trying to integrate, whether it be the hospitals and the physicians and the patients and the pharmacies and the nursing homes. It seems like you also need the information to be easily flowing across all those points and having every point along that road interacting with it.
Yeah, and I think we see pockets of that happening. So we certainly see, as we're seeing these systems coalesce and fewer larger systems, we're beginning to see them standardize across a single instance of an EHR system. I think another positive thing that we're seeing is that I'm pretty excited about is that they're beginning to emerge some interoperability standards across EHR systems that will allow us to play better systems, and even between hospitals that have the same system technically, but that they still can't talk to each other. And so, but in addition to being able to more standardize across just patient data, I think the other thing that interoperability will bring is it will begin to allow for the outside vendors to help make the EHR better and to make it better for clinicians. So one thing is sitting on the I can put myself on the outside vendor side of things at the moment. One thing that's very difficult is that we build tools that we think can have an impact within the in the workflow within the EHR, but it's not scalable because every implementation is different. But
right.
As these interoperability standards emerge, now we can build tools that can actually scale across many systems. So, for example, we're building something we're calling advanced clinical decision support that will allow us to take information out of the EHR and push relative decision support back to the clinician even when they didn't realize they had a clinical question. And we can do that because we can scale this across, we'll be able to scale this across many systems now. So I think you're going to see, and actually I don't think, I know we're already starting to see many more healthcare IT vendors pop up who are trying to build tools that will interoperate across EHR systems. And I think that is a great development for medicine.
And actually, that's very interesting because it kind of picks up on a topic that we discussed on a prior show where we're talking about artificial intelligence and machine learning and how that can be able to help advance and improve care, which I think is a very similar concept to what you just said with the tool that you're working on right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of these things are beginning to come together, and there are lots of different ways to come at this. But I think you walk the halls of HIMSS, the big healthcare technology conference, and you see hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of vendors who are now want to be in the healthcare IT space, which is great because in general healthcare technology has lagged behind other technology industries, but now with the EHR and the interoperability of this is beginning to facilitate this type of innovation in healthcare that we haven't before. So there are lots of different ways to attack it, but it's all in the name of innovation and trying to improve care.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree. It seems like you can find a new vendor almost every day. So, obviously, as you just said, and I definitely agree, it shows that there's a lot of opportunity and promise within healthcare. And hopefully by getting all these different companies and individuals involved, it's going to, at the end of the day, be the best thing for healthcare. I'm sure there'll be bumps along the road, as using the EHRs again as an example of that. But I think, in my opinion, you have to start somewhere, and then you can build from there, because you never start at the perfect place.
Yeah, I'm actually optimistic. I mean, we're at this real nexus of healthcare technology and knowledge, and I think there are lots of forces now that are working to bring all of this together. So I'm actually optimistic about that. There was an article in Forbes magazine that talked about just this very thing, and something they said in there really resonated with me, which is we have to, healthcare technology has to come together and take some of the noise and some of the headaches away from physicians. And I think they said something like, let the physicians do what they do best for the patients who need them most. And I really like that as a concept and as kind of a guiding principle for us as in the healthcare IT space.
Yeah, no, I think that's very well said. It's in line with one that you probably hear from the providers a lot, which is let each provider practice up to their level and not be bogged down with tasks or procedures that interfere with that ability.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and that's bringing that whole healthcare continuum, that whole healthcare perspective together, and really allowing us to provide effective care.
Yes. So I can see that we're starting to get close to the end of our time already. So kind of as a way to maybe start wrapping it up, I would ask, what are your predictions for the future? I think you were starting to touch on that where you're saying you're optimistic, and I think that it should be where everyone's perspective is at the moment, that there is a lot of hope and optimism for where we're going. But do you have any particular predictions about what you think will be happening within the next couple of years?
Well, I don't know if I'm a great prognosticator. So I don't know if I have any bold predictions here, but I do think that we are, as we begin to see more and more evolution of interoperability with EHR systems, as we begin to see more and more healthcare technology. Right now, it feels like a bit of an explosion, but I think in the same way that we saw a convergence around EHR systems when there was an explosion of those several years ago, we're going to see a convergence around the technology vendors that can play into those systems. And so I think we're going to be in a very different place from a technology perspective a few years from now.
Yes, no, I think that is always a safe bet with technology, that with the pace at which it's developing, whether it's in healthcare or anywhere else, it's unbelievable. The things that you can do today that you probably couldn't even imagine just 1 or 2 years ago.
Yeah, exactly.
So, well, believe it or not, we're actually out of time already. I would like to thank Dr. Denise Basow for being my guest today and for the great conversation.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Yep, and thank you to everyone for listening. To keep the dialogue going and connect with me, follow me on Twitter at Matt_R_Fisher, and follow the discussion at the hashtag HCDEJURE. I'm Matt Fisher. Until next time.